welcome to the program. The Canadian government has been at the heart of international efforts to support Ukraine. Since January 2014, Canada has pledged more than $140 million in bilateral development for reforms and economic growth. The Canadian Armed Forces have also been key in military training and capacity building programs. A contingent of approximately 200 Canadian Armed Forces personnel have been on a rotating basis in Ukraine as part of Operation UNIFIER since 2014. The mission will continue until at least the end of March 2019. Joining us in the studio to discuss Canada's role in supporting the Ukrainian Armed Forces is Lieutenant Colonel Kris Reeves. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Tamara.
So first off, to start the conversation, can you talk about the Canadian military's role in helping to change the old kind of Soviet-era style Ukrainian military method and model?
Well, I find it interesting that you pick up on the word change, because that is our main role, is to enable reform. Ukraine has asked us to come and bring our Western and some NATO experience and expertise to reforming their armed forces. Well, the difficult challenges they're in the middle of a conflict.
Right. So what are some of the kind of challenges that you've been faced with when you arrived here, and some things that your predecessors have warned you about as well in terms of military training and kind of passing on your style of military training to the Ukrainian side? Well,
it is more than just style. What we're trying to do, we're working with Ukraine to build a combat training center. So, you know, the militaries are most effective in a team environment. So we're not actually training individual Ukrainian soldiers, and we're not actually training individual Ukrainian teams. We're helping them build a training center that Ukrainian teams, we call battle groups, arrive and get the latest in training techniques and practices that they will then apply in the ATO. The challenge is the sheer size of the armed forces and the fact that they're in the middle of a conflict. I wouldn't say it's slowing down the progress, but you know, Ukraine is reforming very fast, so we're doing everything we can to kind of accelerate that with them.
How have you been adapting to the different types of warfare that you've seen, you've heard about? Obviously, you're stationed in Yavry, Western Ukraine, and the conflict in the eastern part of the country. But you've seen the different types of hybrid warfare. This is a term that's been thrown around quite often, and obviously they're changing different tactics on the ground by the Russian-backed separatist forces.
Yeah, exactly.
So how has the approach changed the Canadian military? Well,
how it's changed us is that we had some preconceived notions about what hybrid warfare was, and if I had to put an idea on it, we're kind of here in a battle lab, you know. And while I would not minimize the toll that it's taking on the Ukrainian armed forces, because absolutely they're losing lives quite often, but the idea that we are in an environment where we're learning from their experiences in the ATO, we're applying some suggestions on training, they're taking that training and bringing it back to the ATO. It's a constant back and forth, systematic approach that it's having effect in the ATO, but it's also building a stronger armed force. We are then rotating trainers and mentors every 6 months here. So we're taking that experience back to Canada, and we have our own combat training center in Alberta, which in fact it's taken us well over 10 years to build. And I'd mention that Ukraine is building theirs within 5.
So it's a completely different time scale in terms of creating a new model, a new system.
Yes, oh my gosh, it's exponentially faster, and it is going very well. But you know, just the size of the conflict and the size of their armed forces means that there is quite a bit more work to do.
Right. Now, how does the Canadian military prioritize in terms of training techniques? For example, we've seen different types of warfare, like I just mentioned. You know, there's electronic warfare where drones are being jammed.
Yep.
And we have Ukrainian troops conducting different reconnaissance, intelligence gathering missions in order to kind of stay ahead of the actual kind of combat. So in terms of the Canadian military prioritizing what type of training the Ukrainian side needs the most?
Well, what we do is, rather than focus on a specific capability or a specific technique or technology, we're focusing mostly with the Ukrainians on how to integrate that. So integrating multiple capabilities on the battlefield, integrating and creating synergy from all of those assets, that's what we're focusing on with the Ukrainians. The post-Soviet model is big, large divisions of military force. Canada, being a smaller nation than, say, the United States or Russia, our expertise is at what we call the battle group level. 1,000-man teams with multiple military capabilities, very agile, the ability to modularize, to react, to call on assets you need above and around. That's where our expertise is. So we're, I think, working with the Ukrainians how best to integrate all that together.
So nothing in particular, just kind of a general overview, a general style that the Ukrainian military is supposed to adopt?
Well, yes. I mean, generally, that is the approach. It's all about integration, because I think Ukraine knows the type of specific capabilities it needs in the ATO. They know that they're facing unprecedented information warfare. They know they're facing unprecedented electronic warfare. They are putting procurement steps in place to deal with that. What we're helping them do is take this great technology and these techniques that they're learning and apply them in a fashion that is, I think, more applicable to the conflict they're in.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of experience is the Canadian side getting from the training, considering that, as you just right. said, it's a completely different combat scenario, it's a completely different environment? I would say that
the number one thing that we've learned here is the speed at which hybrid warfare takes place. Back in Canada, we understood that information warfare is happening. Jamming happens, but we would allow ourselves to train in that environment with more room to maneuver. In Ukraine, the minute they try to put up an unshielded electronic device, it gets jammed right away. The minute they try to counter an information non-fact or information warfare message, it could get countered. So the speed at which hybrid warfare is applied here was very surprising to us. But that has allowed us to change our training methods back in Canada and anticipate that speed.
So there's no room for mistakes, basically.
There isn't, and unfortunately, Ukraine has found that out.
The hard way.
That's right.
There's been over 10,000 casualties.
Yes.
In the Russian-backed separatist conflict with the government troops. But what are some of the kind of valuable lessons that you find your troops learning from the Ukrainian side?
If I think about that for a moment, especially in the context of this weekend, the most important thing the Ukrainian armed forces can have is the support of its own people, because an armed force is drawn from and of its nation. And so what Ukraine doesn't lack is pride. It doesn't lack resolve. So that's how Canada, I think, also in a kind of another approach to warfare is we do not lack resolve, and our commitment to Ukraine is absolutely unwavering. So here on Remembrance Day weekend that we celebrate in Canada, and we've brought forward to Ukraine, understanding that that Ukraine is with its soldiers, and they understand that we're here with them as well. I think that's something that is very powerful for me, and it allows us to dedicate over a year of our lives, of my soldiers here, and a year of the next rotation's soldiers as well.
And what's the general feeling that you get when you speak with the Ukrainian soldiers who've come back from the combat zone?
They're committed, absolutely committed. I just spoke to an entire company of Ukrainian soldiers in Yavoriv 3 days ago with my regimental sergeant major. We talked to their sergeants, and the first thing they said is, we want to go back to the ATO, but not until they finish their training in Yavoriv. They have some new recruits that they're bringing up. They're operating with some of the training techniques that we're showing them through our Ukrainian counterparts that are also training them. But they want to get back to the ATO. So that tells me that the resolve is there. Their soldiers want to win this conflict, and we want to help them reform their military so that they'll win this one and they'll be prepared for the next one.
Right. So long-term planning, I guess.
Very long-term view, yes.
So what about the kind of interaction between Canadian and Ukrainian armed forces at the Yavoriv Training Center, as well as, you've mentioned that you have traveled around different parts of Ukraine, and you've met various different groups of soldiers, of veterans. Right.
Well, we are doing quite a bit more here than just our team in Yavoriv. So we're providing counter IED and combat engineer training in Kamianets-Podilsky. We're looking to establish a faculty support team to the Odessa Military Academy. We're helping the development of a sniper training program in Desna, medical training in Desna, and we're also trying to introduce this idea to Ukraine about the non-commissioned officer. Ukraine has some of the most educated and smartest officers I've ever interacted with, but there's a gap in the role of the non-commissioned officer. So we're working in that way as well. Also, though, on a personal level, my soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers play soccer together. They eat together. They suffer out in the training area together in the cold and the wet. So we do that, and that builds bonds between our two nations. And it also builds some credibility, because don't forget, these Ukrainian soldiers are just back from the ATO. My soldiers are back from Canada. And in Canada, we have nobody encroaching on our sovereignty.
It's a completely different atmosphere.
Absolutely.
Basically.
Nobody's trying to tell us what to do. Nobody has said that you don't deserve to have this part of your country anymore. So we try to get inside the mindset of the Ukrainian soldier, and we're achieving that. Also, we're trying to understand, I think, Ukrainians writ large. So we every opportunity we can take advantage of, we do to understand cultural outreach. Like as today we mentioned, it's Remembrance Day tomorrow. So in Canada, the week leading up to Remembrance Day is known as Veterans Week. So we send out all of our Canadian Armed Forces members to various schools and local communities. We are doing that here in Lviv.
To try and incorporate that kind of culture of respecting veterans and,
they do respect their veterans. We just wanted to have an opportunity to outreach with the citizens of Lviv. And we're doing that in some of our other towns that we're based in as well. But there's many, many more examples too of cultural interaction that I'd love to talk about.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll have you on the next time you're in Kiev. We can talk more about your experiences, that with the Ukrainian troops and the Canadian troops, and how you guys have been working together. Thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Okay, it's been my pleasure. I think one of the most important things we can do here is just explain more to Ukrainians that Canada's here. We're committed, and we have a real important role to share together, and we're not going anywhere, right? So
and that's the most important message, really.
Yes.
So that has been Lieutenant Colonel Kris Reeves from Canada. You're watching UATV.